gonna leap in to Boyle. I will probably not be watching the chat. So Sarah, if there is something you think I need to know, send me a text message. And we are also going to be recording my presentation, but we are not going to record any discussion that we might have time to have afterwards so that people feel maximally free to share what they wish to share. So I'm just going to leap in. Sarah, are we recording? I assume, yes.
We are in fact recording, yes.
Fantastic. She signed them S.L. Patton or Sarah Lindsay or Sarah P. Boyle. She wrote as Mrs. Roger Boyle Jr. and S. Lindsay Patton. By keeping these names in rotation, I could print an awful lot of letters to the editor without seeming to take over the page, she explained to the editor of the Norfolk, Virginia Pilot 10 days after he published a letter in which Sarah Patton Boyle declared her, quote, distress that so few voices publicly defended African Americans. She wrote to the editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch and asked, is it permissible to send in 2 letters under different names? I could use my maiden name or a pen name, which I regularly use for pot boilers, or an entirely different and unrecognizable name. She helpfully enclosed a card listing the options. She asked the editor to check his preferences and get the card back to her. This was in the very early phase of Sarah Patton Boyle's civil rights work, when she still believed that most white people in Virginia thought as she thought. Later, after enough snubbings from white friends, after a cross was burned on her lawn, after members of the Citizens Council sent an ambulance to her house in the middle of the night, we got a call to come to this address and pick up the mangled or dead body of Mrs. Boyle. She came to see otherwise. But this was when she still, quote, held faith that people are wonderful, when she still expected people to manifest goodness that they then failed to manifest. So Patty Boyle liked to stress when she talked about herself that she was born among the so-called first families of Virginia. She was happy to use that phrase, the elite white families of Virginia. Her memoir, The Desegregated Heart, published in 1962, told versions of the stock stories that other white elites of the segregated South liked to tell when discussing their childhood. What she called the code, or what she called the rules of the Southern way of life. She talked about how the code and those rules of the Southern way of life were instilled in her as a child. She talked about how when she turned 12, she was told that the Black people who worked for her family were now to call her Miss Patty, and that she was no longer allowed to play with or even talk to their children. She says in this book that these childhood formations in the code or the Southern way of life ensured that Sarah Patton Boyle behaved as a typical member of her social class for the first 40 years of her life. She married a man who taught drama at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. She gave birth to 2 sons. She was a lifelong Episcopalian, and she went to countless Sunday services in Episcopal churches. She employed various Black women to wash the dishes and clean the apartment. But then Boyle began to notice some things that she had not noticed before. And the code began to seem less inviolable, less natural. Her first noticings actually didn't have anything to do with discrimination against Black Southerners. Rather, they had to do with discrimination against Jews. She met first one and then a second young Jewish man, each of whom spoke to her of the barriers that they faced. She read Milton Steinberg's The Making of the Modern Jew and was shaken by the account of anti-Semitism that she found there. She wrote, something in me seemed struggling to get free. I had a strong feeling that the problem was mine, that I had a job to do in connection with it. Another disquieting noticing came via the radio. Norman Thomas was making one of his recurrent bids for the presidency, and Boyle chanced upon a broadcast from the Socialist Convention headquarters. And the speaker she heard in that broadcast was a Southern Black man. The man said that the platform at the Socialist Convention was the first time in his life that he had, quote, known human dignity. The first time in his life that he had known human dignity. Those words pressed at Boyle, and they unnerved her. The socialist and the Jews had shown her something, or better, they cleared away some brush so that she might be able to see a little bit more than she had seen before. And then when Boyle was 44, the event occurred that she later identified as, quote, the turning point in my life. An African-American lawyer named Gregory Swanson was admitted to the University of Virginia Law School. He was the first African-American who was thus admitted. And Sarah Patton Boyle was determined to welcome Swanson to Charlottesville. Eventually, Boyle and Swanson met. By that time, Boyle, who had for years been an occasional contributor to Ladies' Home Journal and other women's magazines, had written an article insisting that many white Virginians were happy for the University of Virginia to be integrated. She hoped to publish this article in Reader's Digest, and she asked Gregory Swanson, the law student, to read a draft of her article ruthlessly for errors. Here is what happened next, and I'm quoting from her account of this in the desegregated part. We sat opposite each other at a small table. He couldn't, I was sure, fail to be touched, as well as pleased by the way I had written it without a single concession to inherited prejudice. Expressionless, he read it through. Then, without raising his eyes from the page, he said, "And you intend to publish that?" He looked up. If I had been standing, I would have stepped back. His eyes were the incarnation of hostility, fury. "I suppose I can't stop you," he said. "Still, I wish you would refrain from printing that kind of thing about me, at least while I'm at the university." He rose, turned, walked through the door and down the rotunda steps without glancing at me again. Boyle, to put it plainly, was devastated by this encounter, and she was confused. Seeking to understand Gregory Swanson's reaction to her article, she wrote to T.J. Sellers, who was a local Black newspaper editor, and she asked him to read and criticize her article. Sellers took her inquiry at face value and eventually shredded her essay, pointing out countless instances of the condescending noblesse oblige and the historical and sociological inaccuracy that saturated Boyle's writing. Boyle felt indignant when she received Sellers's critique, but she was desperate to learn, and she persuaded Sellers to give her what turned into essentially a multi-year private tutorial in American history and sociology, teaching her to see the South, past and present, from a perspective other than that of the so-called first families of Virginia. The T.J. Sellers course for backward Southern whites, she calls it in the desegregated part. Her study with Sellers changed Sarah Patton Boyle. It eroded ingrained prejudices. It cleared more brush until one weekend in May 1951. Quote, "I knew I must decide definitely and finally whether or not I would fight in the battle for racial equality. I made my decision on a Friday night, and all day Saturday, I was sick within. The Southern code muttered in my ear." Saturday turned to Sunday, and on Sunday, Boyle went to church. In her memoir, there's a really lovely play between the individual and the community, between the lone believer and the church. What happens in church on Sunday confirms Boyle's Friday night decision. church authenticates or maybe completes her seemingly solo choice. She gets to church, St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Charlottesville, and the opening hymn is this first hymn that I have a snip of on the PowerPoint by Charles Bax. This is a hymn that Charles Bax wrote in response to World War I. Earth shall be fair and all her people one. Boyle said, it seemed a benediction, a blessing on the course I had chosen. So too seemed the hymn that was sung before the sermon. That's this next hymn, which is a setting of 5 stanzas of abolitionist poet James Russell Lowell's verses suggested by the present crisis. Lowell was writing originally about the war in Mexico, or excuse me, the war with Mexico and the attendant debate about the expansion of slavery in the United States. It was a poem that King quoted in his last speech in Memphis, and it was set to music as a hymn. Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide. This also seemed like a blessing on her Friday night decision. Finally, the priest took to the pulpit, and Boyle remembers him saying in his sermon, if you decide on the basis of love for your fellow man and of a desire to do what is right, you may be sure that you chose according to God's will. So she has this experience with Gregory Swanson and this tutorial with TJ Sellers. She has this kind of inner crisis experience on a Friday night in May 1951, and her commitment to civil rights work is confirmed when she goes to church that Sunday. And that month, she began her letter to the editor campaign. So, back to the letter to the editor campaign. When Sarah Patton Boyle failed to persuade the Richmond Times-Dispatch to publish endless letters signed with variations of her maiden and her married names, she hatched a new idea. She would organize white men and women with similar pro-integrationist views into a brigade of letter writers. She could write her own letters supporting integration, and then she would organize other similarly pro-integrationist white Virginians to write their own letters to the editor. So she scoured white newspapers. She contacted anyone who had written a single letter supporting integration. She urged them to write more. She called up sympathetic acquaintances who had never dreamed of writing to a newspaper and proposed they try their hand at it. Her aim was to flood the white newspapers of Virginia with letters from white people protesting segregation. And Boyle needed as many people as possible to write, or at least to sign, pro-integration letters to the editor. Again, this is the summer of 1951. And if her friends and acquaintances were willing, but not actually capable, so they shared her commitment to integration, but they weren't very good writers, she would draft the letter herself and affix their signatures to it. In all, some 19 people let her write letters in their names. By September, she had placed in Virginia's newspapers 29 letters advocating the end of Jim Crow. And Boyle was confident that, quote, as soon as I can get some other writers to functioning and line up a few more signers, this campaign will be able to make itself felt in real earnest. Realizing that if she was going to start drafting dozens of letters a week, that she would inevitably begin to repeat this or that turn of phrase, Boyle began to recruit other ghostwriters. She created an elaborate handwritten chart to sync letter drafters, signatories, and newspapers. One of her correspondents was a man named John Wetzel, a like-minded launderer based in Danville, Virginia, whom she'd only known for about 10 minutes and who was dying of ALS. The letter that Boyle wrote to Wetzel after he informed her that he was dying of ALS is a remarkable letter. First, with a near manic energy, she devotes an entire page to urging Wetzel to pray for healing. All you need is sufficient faith to open up the channel to God. I want you to know that you can heal yourself and that I shall not be the least surprised to learn that you have done so. I don't think your work here is finished. And then, having hectored him to pray his way to health, Boyle invited Wetzel to join her team of letter writers. He could perhaps write letters from his sickbed, or maybe he could locate one or two other people to sign letters that he or she might draft. He could, quote, take over the typing, mailing out, and checking to see if they are printed. This is what she suggests to a man who has told her that he is in bed dying of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. So we might pause to ask, what is more remarkable, that she asked this of a dying man, or that in his last months of life, despite the paralysis affecting his vocal cords and making it difficult to therefore dictate correspondence, Wetzel accepted the invitation and joined Patty Boyle's letter writing brigade? Boyle also tried to recruit Lillian Smith. This was about 2 years after the Georgia writer Lillian Smith had published Killers of the Dream, a remarkable book that had clinched Smith's reputation as the most insightful white analyst of the rot at the center of the South. Lillian Smith was at this point a very famous writer analyzing Jim Crow and racism. Boyle had never met Smith, but unsurprisingly, Boyle admired her with an admiration verging on awe. Writing to Smith at the summer camp for girls she ran with her partner, Paula Snelling, Boyle cast her vision of flooding Southern newspapers with letters by white Southerners sympathetic to integration. Insisting that the plan was a child of your brain, she asked Smith to join her in drafting letters to be signed by others. Let's try it, she urged Smith. What have we got to lose? Lillian Smith very gracefully evaded the invitation. Your idea of letters is so good, so really good, she wrote, before stiff-arming Boyle and claiming that her health prevented her from taking part in the letter writing campaign. Again, this is 1951, and perhaps Patty Boyle's campaign seems to us, from the distance of almost 75 years, to be strange, foolish, quixotic, naive. It may be all those things, but it may also be remarkable. I think it is remarkable. Boyle believed, it seems, that she could ghostwrite the South into integration. Before her retirement from civil rights work in the late 1960s, Patty Boyle did a whole lot of things as a civil rights activist. She gave a lot of speeches. She led a get out the vote drive for a referendum on the establishment of a public housing authority, deeming the church, St. Paul's, where she had experienced that confirmation of her call to civil rights, deeming that church too slow on race matters. She left St. Paul's and began attending Charlottesville's predominantly Black Trinity Episcopal Church. She testified in 1958 in an NAACP suit against Virginia. She marched in the March on Washington. She was arrested in 1963 at a protest in Florida of a segregated motel. She did all of these things in her life as a civil rights activist, but she was first and foremost a writer. She was first and foremost a writer. She had in her 30s written under the name Patty Patton pieces like, "How far can you stretch a dollar?" She said she wrote these articles for women's magazines to keep her mind lively and to generate income when the children were young. But once she joined what she referred to as the integration struggle, most of her writing was devoted to what she called the struggle of right and wrong. She wrote scads of articles for magazines and newspapers. Her 1962 memoir, The Desegregated Heart, found Black and white readers all over the country. Having devoted herself to writing this memoir, Boyle then devoted herself to learning the mechanics of making money publishing books. She didn't get rich, but she knew this was going to be her business of sorts. And she began to write in fairly short order her second book, a practical guide for Black and white people seeking to get to know one another. And of course, there were all those letters to the editor. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk a little bit about in whose company I think of Sarah Patton Boyle. And one of the people that comes to mind when I think of her is the theologian Blaise Pascal. In the last decade of his life, Pascal obsessively pursued the idea in writing, obsessively pursued the idea that a certain theoretical understanding of grace was the right one. He wrote about this topic almost fanatically, and it destroyed parts of his life, leading to his being censured by ecclesiastical authorities and leading to the loss of some of his intimate associates. I think also of Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian who was possessed by the task of eviscerating Hegel. I think of Kierkegaard writing endlessly his desire that the world, the Christian world, and the gospel be available, and writing his certainty that Hegelianism won't let you have those things. Hegelianism gives you only a thesis and an antithesis instead. For many years, my only real acquaintance with Sarah Patton Boyle was a copy of this book, which I had purchased from a used bookstore in Charlottesville and sort of half read and had it sitting on my shelf. And for those years, I assumed that if one were to class her with the saints, if one were to ask, who among the saints does she keep company with? You would probably find her alongside other activists, people like Will Campbell and Dorothy Day, and maybe even Norman Morrison. These were mid to late 20th century activists. They were race traders, they were class traders, they were Christians who allowed their convictions about who their neighbors were to make their own lives strange. They all had views about who their neighbors were, and those views estranged them from their social location. And that's who I would have put Patty Boyle alongside. But more and more lately, I see her saintliness as participant in that long tradition of Christian writers who were obsessed by an idea and who followed that obsession with their pen, often pseudonymously, as it turns out. Consuming obsession occupies a significant place in the Christian saintly tradition. Most of us in the church are not thus obsessed. Most of us are not consumingly obsessed. It's rare that someone accords a single thing all seriousness and all focus and makes that thing truly central to the ordering of life. Most people, myself very much included, do a little of this and a little of that. Most of us never coalesce around a single center. And when those of us who do a little of this and a little of that encounter someone who is coalesced around a single center, we often admire that person. We often learn something from her. We often feel disconcerted and slightly horrified. Consuming saintly obsession is admirable because it's a kind of clarity and it's a kind of love. And the church always needs people who love in just that way. If there were no such people, there would be much that we wouldn't see. Saints of consuming obsession repeatedly and emphatically give voice to an understanding of what counts. In Pascal's case, what counts about grace. In Boyle's case, what counts about racist discrimination. Saints of consuming obsession show off what they see to the church and to the world. I'm going to tell you again, they say, and again, and here again, just a little differently. Most of us are not like that. Most of us are more dilute, likely to address and attend one thing for a little while, then we go on to something else. The church needs people like us also. The church needs people who do a little of this and a little of that. And our habit of being has much to commend it. It's a habit of being that can sometimes make space for raising a child while earning a salary. It's a habit of being that runs local churches. You cannot typically run a local church from a posture of consuming obsession with one thing. Running a local church requires doing a little of this and a little of that. It's a habit of being that can make space for avocation, or the altar guild. But what it cannot offer, the habit of this and that, what it cannot offer is the remorseless drumbeat that clarifies and directs. In time, her optimism, her confidence that the majority of white Southerners supported integration, her belief that a small army of letter writers would give confidence to those scared to speak out, and soon there would be a large army, and before too long, the resistance of those few white Virginians truly committed to segregation would be overcome. In time, that optimism was destroyed. It wasn't simply that James Jackson Kilpatrick was taking to the pages of his Richmond News Leader to argue that the Commonwealth of Virginia could constitutionally defy the US Supreme Court. It wasn't just that an Episcopal church in Patton's own Charlottesville was offering its Sunday school classrooms for all white study so that the public schools in town could close rather than integrate. More intimate than all of that public sin were the many friends who disappointed Patty Boyle. Friends who'd sworn they shared her views, no longer invited her to parties, and wouldn't make eye contact if they saw her in town. Trying to raise money for the Virginia Council on Human Relations in the mid-1950s, Boyle approached a friend who'd often privately boosted Boyle's confidence and cheered her on. He'd also recently undertaken a $50,000 renovation of his home. Boyle asked him to spend several $100s on council memberships. Now I'm quoting from her book. Leaning forward on a $1,000 couch, he murmured, "We just can't afford it, darling. How I wish we could." Surprised but undaunted, Boyle proposed the $25 membership category, then the $5 category. "Not even that, honey. You see, with the new edition and all, but don't think we aren't with you. You know how we feel." Perhaps even more galling was the stunning rapidity with which fair weather friends who'd utterly shunned Boyle suddenly softened toward her as soon as the Charlottesville City Schools integrated with relative calm in September 1959. "I've thought of you and prayed about you so often in these months. Can't we get together? I've so much to tell you." Or, "You spoke for us all. I didn't feel I ever had to say anything because you said everything that needed to be said, and you said it so beautifully." Were these men and women sincere? Boyle thought they probably were. Whatever they had done or not done a few minutes ago, they meant what they were saying now. But Boyle was unmoved by her erstwhile friend's warm gestures. She had become too internally impoverished to care. Quote, "In 1950, I had many inner mansions, built of the loftiness of man, the mellow loveliness of Dixie, the steadfastness of friends, my own capacity to give and take. Nothing remained of all this now." When reading Boyle's descriptions in The Desegregated Heart of the friends she had once judged reliable and steadfast, I think of nothing so much as the biblical book and character of Job. Perhaps Boyle will have friends again, but she comes to believe that she has vested too much hope in human capacity and in human goodness, that she was mistaken to look to human beings rather than to God for enduring love, and that she would now make the grounding of any loves she might give or receive not the unsteadiness of human love, but rather the God who is love and who will store up her loves where moth and rust do not corrupt. It's no surprise that she spent herself, that her work became her exhaustion. If newspaper reports describing her are to be believed, throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Patton worked an average of 18 hours a day, writing, traveling, and speaking. Her own accounts of exhaustion are inflected, of course, with the presumptions of her social class and gender. Dear Elizabeth, she wrote in October 1955 to Mrs. J. Waties Waring, another white pro-integrationist who had by then left South Carolina for New York. Dear Elizabeth, I really ought to move north, for there's no Southern leisure in my life anyhow. I just go from one pressure to another. But if, after all, you have 2 children, a husband, and crusade, and no maid, and try even to do the family laundry and to keep up church and civic activities, you just don't have time for the letter writing you would like to do, or even for the reading either. Again, she's writing with a little bit of irony, but her account of her exhaustion is very much inflected with her presumptions of class and gender. Or as she wrote the month before, I must leave on the 6 a.m. train to speak at the NAACP in Gloucester tomorrow, getting home at 1:10 a.m. the next day, so must get my house and icebox in order to leave the family. So she's going off to do this public political work, but she still has to leave a meal for her husband and 2 kids. I imagine that reading the mail she received was in a different way exhausting. Here are some examples of the hate mail that she received. I'll just leave these for us to read for a moment. I would think receiving such hate mail would be exhausting. Boyle was courageous in the face of anger and threat. When that cross was burned on her lawn, she grabbed her 13-year-old and said, look, they're burning a cross for Mother. Isn't it beautiful? Of these letters and letters like them, she said that having received them, she could not put them out of her mind when she encountered an ostensibly polite middle-class segregationist. It was exhausting, too, to pursue the commitments of a non-Manichaean approach to politics. That's my gloss to call her approach non-Manichaean, to invoke the Manichaean heresy. That is not a term that, as far as I'm aware, Boyle uses. But threading through Boyle's correspondence is a refusal to see even the struggle for civil rights as a struggle of the wholly righteous battling the wholly corrupt. Boyle suggests that there is something fatiguing in the capacity to see flaws and foibles in one's comrades, and also fatiguing in the capacity to see something other than corruption in one's foes. And here again, she's writing to Elizabeth Waring, and she gives voice to that non-Manichaean approach to politics. If only the opposition were entirely wrong all the time, how simple the fight would be. In the estimation of historian Jennifer Ritterhouse, Boyle was, quote, the most outspoken white integrationist in Virginia. But Boyle has not been much remembered, which is curious, given that Charlottesville, where she lived during this era of her life, has always been a town fairly obsessed with its own memory of itself. In 2001, Boyle was one of 8 local Charlottesvillians, living and dead, designated a, quote, bridge builder. That designation earned her a small plaque on a bridge on West Main Street. But other than that plaque, as far as I know, she doesn't have any other public memorials. I'm not aware of any other ones at any rate. And I lived in Charlottesville when I was in middle school and high school in the 80s and early 90s, and I don't recall of ever having heard of Patty Boyle during my childhood. Jennifer Ritterhouse, the historian, thinks that Patty Boyle is perhaps not much remembered because of her piety, because of the ways she really drenches this book, The Desegregated Heart, in a kind of Christian language of piety, and in the way that she explores in this book how working for civil rights tarnished her faith in human beings, but transformed her faith in God. And Ritterhouse thinks this makes Boyle, quote, unfamiliar and maybe even uncomfortable reading for secular audiences today. And Ritterhouse suggests that's perhaps why, or part of why, she's not much remembered. But I would like to suggest that perhaps Boyle is not much remembered because in the end, she didn't accomplish very much, which is what we have to say about most white Southerners in the civil rights movement. The story of that movement's victory, or to borrow a phrase from historian David Chappelle, what made civil rights move, was by and large the actions of African Americans. And when the actions of white liberal Southerners like Virginia Foster Durr or P.D. East did help the movement, they helped largely because of African American strategic and savvy use and exploitation of white Southerners' gestures. So maybe we don't much remember Sarah Patton Boyle because in the end, her achievements were modest. Near the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the book club at my church, which was a largely white congregation in a small town in Piedmont, North Carolina, the book club at my church read this book, The Desegregated Heart. Our book club met on Zoom. It was a small crowd, me and maybe 6 or so congregants. One of them, an artist who had led the town to remove its Confederate monument a year before, said he thought the book was not really about what Patty Boyle found in her activism. It was about, the congregant said, what Patty Boyle lost. What are you willing to be a fool for? My congregant asked. And of course, the measure of the holy fool is never what she accomplishes. In 1957, James McBride Dabbs, the race liberal from South Carolina, who was a correspondent of Boyle, wrote a letter to Patty Boyle. And in that letter, he sort of lamented and complained that he had never had a cross burned on his lawn as she had. But Dabbs was enough of a Christian to criticize his own metric. Oh, well, he wrote to her, no one ever knows just what effect he has. Our job is to go ahead and do the best we can. As Robert Frost said, something has to be left to God. Which is to say, when you read someone who bears witness, or when you encounter someone who bears witness, what's important is not that the writer you're reading accomplished something. What's important is that her witness gives you clarity about what's really going on. Maybe Boyle was a great success after all, if what counts as success is doing what the biblical prophets did, just saying some true things, regardless of their effect, regardless of the effect the proclamation did or did not have on their listeners. Just saying some true things because bringing the message is what they were called by God to do. In 1965, 14 years after that inner conversion to civil rights work and that fateful liturgical confirmation of that in church, in 1965, she divorced. In 1967, she left civil rights work. Quote, racial conflict was no longer the field of my endeavor, she explained to one interlocutor. She believed that what she called the Black Power approach did not have space for her. She wrote a letter to T.J. Sellers, the newspaper editor who so many years ago had helped educate her. And in that letter, she adverted to Ecclesiastes. There's a time to speak and a time to be silent, she said. I'm glad that when it was time to speak, I spoke. When I suggest that Patty Boyle didn't accomplish very much, I don't mean to damn her with faint praise. I only mean to suggest the limits of consequentialist reasoning, the limits of judging what we do by what it achieves. What she did was tell the truth over and over about the harm and injustice of segregation and of other forms of racism. Over and over, God gave her some things to say, and she said them. The primary sources for this lecture are her own papers that are at the University of Virginia, and of course her memoir, The Desegregated Heart. But I do want to offer you, if you find yourself interested in this topic, some secondary sources for further reading on Southern childhood during Jim Crow, a really wonderful monograph and study about how Black and white children sort of learned the racial codes of Jim Crow, Jennifer Ritterhouse's Growing Up Jim Crow. Some of you might be very interested in Fred Hobson's book, But Now I See, which looks at white Southerners who got kind of converted to the civil rights movement, and then for whom that in turn sort of converted them to a deeper Christian faith. David Chappelle's Inside Agitators, White Southerners in the Civil Rights Movement. And I've published an essay that explores some of this, and it's in this really interesting volume. This would be a great volume to read with a church. It's 12 different essays of theological biography, looking at different figures, Jesus-haunted misfits, malcontents, and dreamers in pursuit of justice, and exploring their theological convictions and giving theological readings of them. So that is what I have to say about Sarah Patton Boyle.